Hello, my name's Pat Muchmore, and I have a new album coming out on July 29th, 2016. It's being released by Innova Records, and it's called BABEL Fragments. This is what the artwork looks like. And today I wanted to explain something that is very commonly asked of me. The most common question probably that I ever get is, what's the deal with all the crazy titles? Do they mean anything? They do, at least usually, and I'm going to explain the title of the second piece on the record. I would love to do it for you in video wearing my nice fancy suit, but my brain would explode if I tried to do that in a mirror image the whole way through. So instead, let me switch to a perhaps easier to see view. So here's a clearer view of the back CD cover, and you can see underneath the title of the album itself, we have 4 pieces on this record. There's actually 32 tracks because each piece has a bunch of movements, but there's only 4 large-scale pieces. There's this piece here, which is first, which, if you'll notice, especially this part, is very similar to the name of the third piece, fr.2.a through k. They're similar because the first and the third piece both belong to a series of pieces I've been writing for a while now that I call fragment pieces. They're short stories that I've written for various instrumentations. So those 2 pieces are very deeply related to each other. The same thing's true of the second and the fourth piece. Here's the title of the second piece, which is the one I'm going to be talking about today, and this is the title of the fourth piece. Very similar because, again, they belong to the same series of pieces. In this case, it's a series of pieces called BABEL pieces, and my BABEL pieces are concerned with languages and problems of translation, both musical and literary, and these 2 pieces are some of the most important examples of those series. As you can see, I've given a sort of simplified name, Babel Maya and Sheshach Maya, for these pieces. That's for convenience sake, in order to be able to actually talk about them a little bit. But the real title is this. And you can see why I called it Babel Fragments, this album, because I've got 2 fragment pieces and 2 Babel pieces, and that was also part of the inspiration when my wife, Jenny Martin, designed the CD art. She used fragments of this Kirchner lithograph of the Tower of Babel in constructing the artwork. Very cool. Anyway, here is the large version of the title of the second piece. Again, I call it Babel Maya for conversational purposes, but this is the real title. For now, ignore this part of the title, which is completely separate, and I'll talk about that at the end. This is the main part of the title. All of my Babel pieces are named in 5 different languages, or rather 5 different scripts. And always I'm spelling out the word Babel or a different code word that the Hebrew Bible sometimes uses for Babel, Sheshach. I can't go into details about why that's used sometimes, but it's just basically a code word that the writers of the Hebrew Bible used for the same town, Babylon. Anyway, all of the Babel pieces are named by taking the letters of the English word Babel and transliterating them into 5 different scripts. This is one of the more complicated examples of that, but I think I can show you. For example, here, this part that I've boxed in is the ancient Mayan hieroglyph for the letter B. It's very, very cool. The whole Mayan script, I'll talk about a few more details of it in a second. It's one of the most exquisite scripts in all of human history. Then we have the letter A, so the Mayan was B, and this is A in the old runic Futhark alphabet that was used throughout Northern Europe for quite a while. Down here we have a visual representation of da, deet, 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 which is the International Morse code for the letter B. So again, we have ancient Mayan B, Futhark A, and the Morse B down here. Finally, or penultimately, we have E in Korean and L using the lambda character from the Greek alphabet. One of the things that I find most interesting about constructing the titles for these pieces and putting together the pieces themselves is it seems like this should be such a simple kind of process that all you have to do is just find the equivalent symbol that stands for B in whatever other alphabet you're looking at, then find the equivalent symbol that stands for A. It sounds very simple, but the reality is massively more complicated because no two scripts work in exactly the same way. Sometimes a script doesn't even have a symbol for a particular letter in the English version of the Latin alphabet. Sometimes it has many different choices available. And sometimes things are even more extreme than that. I'll give an example in just a second. First off, the way that I've stacked together, sort of clustered the letters of this particular spelling of Babel is actually a result of my choice to use Mayan and to a lesser extent Korean as well. Instead of just writing it out B-A-B-E-L like you normally would in English spelling, I followed the Mayan conventions, and again, to a lesser extent, the Korean conventions, where symbols are usually concatenated together in various ways. In ancient Mayan, it can actually get very, very complicated. You'll find giant chunks that you would think are a single character that actually have 6, 7, or even more glyphs all smushed together in various ways. Entire concepts, even sometimes entire sentences, can be smashed together into what looks like a single symbol, but is actually a concatenation of many symbols. That's what I've done with my BAB here at the start. I've taken those 3 things and combined them into one symbol. Superficially, but interestingly, Korean works somewhat similarly in that it has an alphabet just like the English-Latin alphabet, but it's combined together to form syllables, so that what you would think is maybe a single character is actually often 2 or even 3 characters. I've got an example of that from the Wikipedia page on Korean. This is a spelling in the actual Korean alphabet of both the North Korean word for the alphabet, which I cannot even kind of pronounce, and the South Korean, which I also can't pronounce, but I can come at least a little closer, something like Hangul. You, if you don't know the alphabet, would be forgiven for thinking that this is one character and a second character, Hangul. But the reality is this is actually 6 characters. There's another piece of artwork on the same Wikipedia page that color codes everything. So take these seemingly 2 symbols and look here, and you see this is actually the Hangul symbol for H, the Hangul symbol for A, the Hangul symbol for N, etc., all smashed together to show the syllabification of the word. That's just standard orthography in Korean, and it can make for what initially looks incredibly complex and is actually quite a bit easier to read once you've learned things. So both ancient Mayan and modern Korean gave the inspiration for the clustering of letters that I've used here. Again, part of what's so interesting to me about constructing these titles and trying to make them work is all the different ways in which languages and scripts simply don't translate into each other neatly. The transliteration process is anything but simple. There's a lot of examples I could talk about just in this title alone. For example, those of you who know Korean are probably fairly curious about why I chose to represent my letter E this way. But I'm going to focus on the ancient Mayan symbol here, just because I think it might be of the most interest to the most people. I lied to you earlier. I just totally lied. I told you this was the ancient Mayan symbol for the letter B. There is no such symbol, and if there were, there'd probably be many such symbols. The Mayan writing system is enormously complex compared to the Latin writing system that we use in English, but it does have some phonetic components. Most of the symbols stand for concepts or ideas or words, but there are plenty of symbols in the writing system that stand for phonetic sounds. But unlike English, which uses an alphabet, the Mayan writing system uses something called a syllabary. Here's an example of the Mayan syllabary here. In a syllabary, there's not a single unique symbol for every consonant and a symbol for every vowel. In English, we've got allegedly 21 consonants and 5 vowels. It's actually way more complicated than that, but let's not worry about those details. There are theoretically 21 consonants and 5 vowels, so we have 26 symbols, one for each consonant and one for each vowel. Mayan, much like the hiragana and katakana symbols that are used in modern Japanese writing, is a syllabary. That means there's a unique symbol, or sometimes many different symbols, that stand for a syllable, a combination of a consonant and a vowel. In other words, instead of having a symbol for B and a symbol for A to make the sound ba, they just have a symbol for ba. And that means they also would have to have a symbol for be. In this particular example of a syllabary, they hadn't yet discovered those symbols yet. I think they have since this was made. Here are symbols they could use for the syllable B. Here's a symbol they could use for bo, and here are a couple for bu. In other words, if English worked this way, then our 21 consonants and 5 vowels would mean that as preschoolers we would have to learn 105 different symbols instead of just 26 symbols. 5 for every consonant that we have in our language. Different languages work differently, different scripts work differently. As you can see, one of the most simple ways to represent a syllabary is in a table like this. Along the top we have the 5 vowels that are necessary for talking about ancient Mayan, and along the left side, across many pages, we have all the different consonants that are necessary as well. So if you want to know how to make the symbol for po, then you have to go down to consonant P and then across to vowel O, and here are 2 variants of the symbol for po. Up here is a symbol for mo. So when it came time to come up with a Mayan equivalent for the letter B, I didn't even try to find that. It doesn't exist. Instead, I had to choose one of the 5 syllabic combinations, ba, be, bi, bo, and bu. And even within ba, ba, I had a couple of different choices I could make. I ended up going for this one, which is clearly the coolest one, and you can see that's exactly what I have here. Okay, so you're probably saying, that's fun and all, but, this is supposed to be an album of music. What does this have to do with the music? Well, there's a lot of ways in which the language issues that I'm talking about here inform the pieces in my BABEL series. One of the most important is that large parts of these pieces are written using completely different languages of music. I mean that both literally and figuratively. Literally, I write some parts in completely different musical notations. I use sometimes ancient Greek musical notation, Babylonian notation, Japanese shakuhachi notation, etc. These things sort of force a filter onto the musical ideas I have. In fact, sometimes I'll take the same musical idea and then see all the different ways I can try to approximate it using different notation systems. I'll give you an example of that from this piece, from this album. The second movement has a very brief passage that was written using ancient Greek notation. And ancient Greek notation has sort of baked into it small, tiny musical intervals that aren't as common in Western music that are called quarter tones. And because I was using that notation system, it sort of automatically pushed me to using these especially out-sounding notes that are a quarter tone apart from each other. So I'm going to play just a brief excerpt of that. This was, by the way, a piece written for my friend Kamala Shankaram. She's an incredible composer and a multi-instrumentalist and a coloratura soprano. And I wanted to write a 5-movement piece that included various duets for me on cello and her singing. This movement is just that exactly happening without any kind of electronic additions, and this passage again was written using ancient Greek notation. It's perhaps interesting to make note the English word Babel, B-A-B-E-L, is itself just a transliteration of the Hebrew word that pronounced, I apologize, something like Bavel. This is from the Hebrew Bible whenever Babylon is referred to, and therefore that is itself just a Hebrew transliteration of the Akkadian word Babelu, which means gate of the gods. I hope my font is working right. I think this is one of the ways that that would have been represented. I think it's one of the more ornate ways that word would be represented. This makes for a fun little segue into the other half of the title. Up here is f of 1 is how you would pronounce that, and it's a mathematical notation. Actually, 3 of the 4 pieces on the record have some form of that. Here's f of 4, here's f of 1, here's f of 3. That's because these 3 pieces belong to yet another series of mine that I call the f of x series. To explain that, you just have to go back to your high school math and remember that f of x is a function. Here's an example, x squared plus x plus 1. F of 1, then, is what happens when you plug 1 in for x in the original function. 1 squared plus 1, and you get a result 3. So f of 1 equals 3. Where things get potentially more interesting is when you have something like f of 1. This means not only do you plug 1 into the function, but then whatever result you get, the output of that function, gets fed right back into the original function. So the 1 squared plus 1 equals 3 gets fed right back into the equation. Now we have 3 squared plus 3 plus 1 equals 13. With that particular function, this isn't exactly earth-shattering, but there are a number of important mathematical objects and mathematical ideas that use this kind of recursion in them. Fractals, the study of predator-prey populations, intriguingly makes use of that. Also, a fascinating topic well worth falling into a wiki hole on are strange attractors. These things all involve this kind of recursive function. Musically, what I'm interested in these pieces is taking various types of self-reference, things that contain themselves, fractal ideas, and using them musically. One particularly simple manifestation of that has to do, at least for this piece, with the movements. Here, this is what happens when you open up the CD cover that Jenny Martin designed. And by the way, you better believe these titles became very, very frustrating for her, and she did an amazing job dealing with them. If you look, you'll see all 5 movements are themselves individual pieces. The first movement is also a piece called Portrait 8 in my C10. And here we have yet another Babel piece that exists inside the larger Babel piece. This time the word Babel, B-A-B-E-L, is spelled out using fictional languages. Here's B in Tolkien's Elvish language, A in a fan-created Star Wars writing system. Here's B from the Futurama Alienese script. This is E in a Klingon script, and finally this is an L in St. Thomas More's invented angelic language from his book Utopia. Anyway, the point here is multiple pieces, including other Babel pieces, are contained inside the larger Babel piece. Another important example is in the music itself. There are often fractal melodies that I like to use. These are melodies that contain themselves. I'll play you just an example from the beginning of the first movement of the piece, Babel Maya. What you're going to hear is perhaps just going to sound like a silly explosion of crazy synthesizers. And to some extent, that's precisely what you will be hearing. But it's worth noting that the melody here actually has a somewhat complex fractal structure. In that it contains itself at any number of different speeds. So when you play the same melody on top of itself twice as fast and 4 times as fast and 8 times as fast, or half as fast, a quarter fast, an eighth as fast, it'll line up with itself in a fairly basic sort of way. So here's this example from the beginning of Babel Maya. Okay, so I know that was way more information than you ever really needed to have on something like that, but I hope at least some of it was at least a tiny bit interesting. I'm going to leave you with just a few minutes from the end of the third movement of Babel Maya. This movement in particular features Kamala because it's just for voice and some electronic sounds I created. As a little bit of an Easter egg, you may recall the third letter of the name Babel made use of Morse code. And similarly, the third movement of Babel Maya also makes use of Morse code. In fact, the Morse code that you'll hear just kind of up high is the first ever Morse code message that was sent by telegraph. It is just a biblical phrase, "What God hath wrought." By the way, if you're at all interested in pre-ordering the album Babel Fragments, and if it's before July 29th, 2016, and if you want to just donate to the cause of my making future albums, then please visit my Indiegogo page. You'll find it in a link down below in the description of the video. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you soon.